Hello, everyone. Welcome to the book launch of our colleague Demet Çağatkan's fabulous new book, Conscientious Objection in Turkey, a socio-legal analysis of the right to refuse military service. My name is Jessie Blackburn, and along with Emma Milne, who is in the audience and on the Zoom for you, we're co-directors of the Centre for Criminal Law and Criminal Justice, and Emma is co-director of Gender and Law at Durham, who's co-hosting this book launch for Demet. So without further ado, I'll introduce Demet, and then we'll take it from there. I'll introduce each speaker just before they speak, just so that you get a sense of who's who just before they talk. So Demet is Assistant Professor in Criminal Law and Criminal Justice at Durham Law School. Her research interests include critical military studies with a focus on anti-militarism, socio-legal studies, and gender and criminal law. And she employs a multidisciplinary approach combining feminist and socio-legal methodologies to analyse the relationship between law and society. And we're delighted that you joined us this year at Durham Law School. So I'll hand over to you now to tell us a bit about your book. Thank you.
I have the right to share it, right?
Yeah, you should.
Yeah, okay. All right. Thank you all for being here, whether online or in person. And I'm really excited to talk to you about my work on conscientious objection to military service in Turkey. So actually, my book is a product of my PhD years here in Durham, and that's why I would like to start with thanking to my supervisors, Professor Ian Lee and Professor David McCann, who is my research mentor at the moment, for being there for me for all the time, entire journey from the writing process to the publication of my book with Edinburgh University Press as part of Advances in Critical Military Studies, edited by Dr. Victoria Basham and Dr. Sarah Fulmer. And of course, also I'd like to thank Jessie and Emma for organizing this event and giving me the opportunity to give you the snapshot of my book. And I really hope that you find it interesting enough to read the whole book later in your own time. Before I give you a snapshot of my book and its contents, I would like to invite you to think about very simple and straightforward question: where is militarism? So where is militarism? Is it only confined to the military as an institution, or is it in our streets, or is it in our video games, or in our children's kids stores, or in our streets, as I said? So, or even in our closet, it may be even in our closet. So yes, militarism is everywhere, and the militarized messages that surround us every day are always considered as natural and seen normal and trivial, that we hardly even notice them. Probably on your way here, perhaps you have passed or saw military recruitment billboards asking individuals to join the army, to join the army of the future. Or maybe you have passed a bookstore which displays in its bookshelf a picture of a fallen soldier, or war posters or mugs with phrases like "Hey you" or "A woman in Britain, say go" messages. You may even left a small tip in a small tip box called "Help for Heroes" on a restaurant counter. And as I said, it may be militarism, maybe in your closet. Maybe you have even worn a t-shirt with a military-inspired design. So all of these seemingly trivial and normal militarized messages are actually part of a larger system of militarism that not only shapes our perceptions about violence and war and the military, but also have a huge impact on our legal system as well. So in my book, I aim to unpack the impact of militarism on our society by providing a socio-legal analysis of the right to conscientious objection to military service in Turkey, in a country that adopts many conscription system with no alternative civilian service and with no right to consciously object the military or the military service. So in this book, I had two main objectives. To legally analyze the right to conscientious objection, and also to empirically investigate sociological reasons behind non-recognition of the right to conscientious objection. In the first two chapters, I explored how these seemingly trivial and normal militarized messages are integrated into our everyday life, and also what impact they have on our perceptions of the military and its military's role in our society. I intended to offer insights into the ways in which militarism operates at the micro level, and it operates at micro level, but then shapes our broader social, political, cultural, and also even legal structures. So, in other words, I aim to examine the militarization of society and sociological reasons behind a non-recognition of the right to conscientious objection in Turkey. So by focusing on the historical role of the Turkish armed forces in politics and also everyday life, I examine the institutionalized power of the military and how it shaped our society by very subtle and soft ways. And also I examine the cultural and social norms that lead individuals to believe that the army is a sacred institution. One of the main findings of my main findings was, and it was in line with civil military relation literature in Turkey, was that when the conscription system was introduced in 1927, the initial justification for having large and standing a strong army was that we need to defend our nation against external enemies. And we need to have a strong army to be able to maintain our national security and sovereignty. However, over time, this justification has evolved and conscription became a tool used to create a shared bond and sense of responsibility among Turkish students to sacrifice their lives for the nation, for the sake of the nation. So this approach blurred the line between civil and military areas, and therefore it made it extremely difficult to question the military or to exercise the right to conscientious objection. I did also focus on examine conscription in the light of Turkey's constantly changing socio-political structure, and I found that even though the Turkish armed forces role has decreased and its impact on our politics has decreased, militarism and militarization of society is still an ongoing process, and its militarism still omnipresent in our contemporary world. For example, in this picture, what we see, people are in the street, and their aim is to challenge the military coup attempt in 2026. This shows us that Turkish society also changing, and we don't accept military intervention in politics as a reliable option anymore, which is good. But what was ironic in this protest, in some of them at least, the way they protested the military coup actually reinforced militarism, because they used masculinized and militarized mottos or chanting for death penalties, or all the mottos, they included this masculine and militarized messages. So somehow it reinforced the militarization of society. In the following two chapters, I focused on the legal status of the conscientious objection. I looked at the international and regional standards, and I also examined whether Turkish domestic law is compatible with these international standards. What I found was that despite the legal recognition of the right to conscientious objection at international and regional level, Turkey still refuses to acknowledge this right, and as a result of that, objectors face human rights violations, because they cannot enjoy their rights to conscientious objection. With these chapters, why I examined the international and regional standards, and also I examined the legal obstacles that conscientious objectors face. I highlighted the need for reforms and the need for the state to accommodate different moral beliefs, and also recognize the right to conscientious objection as a fundamental human right. One of the main arguments of my book was that in order to understand the relationship between socio-cultural structure of a society and its legal structures, we need to, it is necessary to understand how these laws operate within society. So in order to understand that, and also provide empirical answers to my research questions, and to understand how these laws or non-recognition of the right to conscientious objection affects those who pursue their conscience, I conducted semi-structured interviews with 20 conscientious objectors, and my participants, they contributed to the study in different ways. For example, they provided first hand insights and information about their experiences, and they enabled me to look at a legal problem from the perspective and unique experiences of those who are the most affected by this non-recognition of the rights. Because of this empirical focus, I was also able to look at the typology and the nature of conscientious objection in Turkey, and also understand its relationship with civil disobedience. And these interviews and my participants also allowed me to understand the link between gender, conscientious objection, and militarism in a society that adopts male conscription system, but still have women conscientious objectors. So, as a summary, while writing this book, one of my aim was to provide a socio-legal and empirical analysis of the right to conscientious objection by focusing on a unique case, which is Turkey. And Turkey provided me a very rich ground to understand the relationship between the law and the laws which predict individuals' conscience and state resistance. I will continue working on militarism and the impact of militarism on individual freedoms, and my next project will be on the intersection between militarism and intimate partner violence, where I will focus on intimate partner violence between military families and couples, where I will also focus on the experiences of victim survivors in critical criminal justice system and also military justice system. Thank you very much for your time. And I'm looking forward to hear our fantastic speakers' comments and presentations.
Perfect. Thank you, David. So I should have said, we'll take all the presentations and then we'll have hopefully some time for questions at the end. Demet, I hope 15 minutes is enough for each of your presents, otherwise we'll run out of time. So first up, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Cheney Ryan, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the University's Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, where he focuses on non-violence, pacifism and the critique of just war theory. He's also the founder and co-chair of the Oxford Consortium for Human Rights, which conducts human rights workshops for students in Oxford, New York, Geneva, amongst other locations. He was involved in the civil rights movement from 1963, worked in an anti-poverty program in southeastern Kentucky in the summers of 1964 and 1965, and became increasingly involved in anti-Vietnam War activities in the 1960s. He's previously taught at the University of Oregon, Northwestern University, Harvard Law School, and Boston University. So I'll turn over to Dr. Cheney Ryan. If you could talk to us for about 15 minutes, please, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, can people hear me?
Yeah.
I'll assume the answer is yes. Okay. Let me say a couple of things. First of all, I am grateful for the honor of participating in this. Let me further say, though, that I'm not a scholar of Turkey. I'm a scholar of conscription and conscientious objection. But that said, I think that anyone who's interested in these topics, wherever they're coming from, will be interested in Demet's book because it addresses to a detail, I think, that is really quite extraordinary, the interconnections between these issues and the situations of particularly in Turkey. And also, I would say, of special interest to me is the discussion of gender and the relation of these things. So what I'm going to do is talk about some questions that arose for me as someone who works on these issues philosophically, but also someone who is most familiar with the situations in the United States and the United Kingdom. I might mention further that I was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. What that actually meant was complicated. It did not mean that I ended up serving prison time, which is what many conscientious objectors did. But it did mean that my life was disrupted for 5 or 6 years by that issue. Okay, so I bring a sort of personal connection to it. The question I want to raise is the relationship of conscription to militarism. And I'm going to raise that in terms of some issues, I think, that problems that we see in the United States in particular. But it also bears on the issue of what we mean by militarism and the relationship of militarism to militarization. I noticed that in Cynthia Enlow's quote that Demet just referenced, there's a equation of militarism with militarization. I don't question that, but I think it further raises the question of what do we mean by militarization. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw up some questions about how this is unfolded in the United States in particular, and then in some sense pose the contrast between what Demet is talking about in Turkey and really what we can learn from that contrast, which I think is a fascinating one. Okay. Let me begin with an observation. In 1965, in the United States, which was already a year or two into the Vietnam War, there was a public poll of what were the most popular institutions in the United States. And by a wide margin, the American people said the most popular institution was the draft, was conscription. In fact, it was more popular than the post office. Most people find this remarkable because since 1965, the situation has completely changed. In fact, and I regard it as one of the most dramatic changes in my lifetime of conscription going from the most popular institution in the United States to one that is really reviled, probably would be the best word. No one could get elected to anything if they endorsed bringing conscription back. Now, let me say also that the difference in attitudes had to do with this issue of militarization. Things were accepted in 1965 that I think people find bizarre now about the United States. An example was that when I was in school, not only was being an officer candidate school in most universities mandatory, which is why I was in officers candidate school myself, but also we were expected to engage in militarist type activities as part of our daily schoolwork. So an example was that every month there was a president's physical fitness test to prepare us for the military, which meant that every month, and it started when I was in the 7th grade, we had to go out and run a 50-yard dash and be timed for it. And that information was then conveyed to the Defense Department. I was never clear, by the way, what the point of running a 50-yard dash was to the military. I didn't know whether it meant we were running towards the communists or away from them. But clearly it was the notion that this kind of heavy militarized model of society, as Demet says, every citizen is a soldier. And that was how one was raised in the 1950s and early 1960s. Now, what changed about this? And what I want to suggest is that in many ways, American society and British society, which is the only one I'm familiar with really, are less militarized than they were in the past. But does that mean that there has been a decline of militarism? Or does it simply mean that there is what Andrew Bacevich calls a new militarism that we're witnessing? And in some sense, part of what I want to pose for Demet's book is the question of how is militarism construed, and are there different forms, and are we in fact in America, which is the hegemonic imperialist power, witnessing a new type of militarism that is quite in contrast to the older form that she seems to be describing in Turkey. Now, let me again go back to some history about how this unfolded in the United States. The debate about conscription began in the late 1960s. And what I think is oftentimes not appreciated is that the people who were in favor of keeping conscription were the liberal wing in American politics. Conscription was in fact opposed primarily by conservatives, and it was endorsed by liberals. So that one of the main voices against abolishing conscription was Senator Teddy Kennedy from Massachusetts. And it was not by any means the notion that being a liberal meant opposing conscription and being a conservative meant endorsing it. Why not? Well, there's two reasons. One is that there was the issue of fairness. That is, absent conscription, it's hard to see that a military will be fair in terms of who fights in it. What liberals said was, if you abolish conscription, you will create a military of primarily working class and minorities, and that's exactly what's happened. There's no argument about that, okay? But the other reason is this, is that universal military service was always construed as a constraint on militarism. Now, this is something that is more complicated issue, but it's important certainly to understanding the American argument about it. And basically the argument was this: if everyone has to serve in the military, then first of all, that will encourage them to be engaged in what's going on in foreign policy in a way that they otherwise wouldn't. If you know that your child has to serve in the military, then you will take more seriously what the wars are that are being fought. So that was very much one issue. But the other issue was, if you fight wars by universal obligation, in fact, that will be a constraint on war, because it means that you need to convince people that those wars are worth fighting in. And this is why not only was some form of universal obligation endorsed by liberals like Teddy Kennedy, but the socialist tradition endorsed it as well. My favorite example is Jean Jaurès in France, the great socialist leader. Another contemporary was Eugene Debs in the United States. These were great voices of the socialist tradition. They said that there should be a universal militia. Wars should be fought by universal militias. That way, popular will provide a constraint on the military. Now, I see this as, in some sense, raising a question of, well, what has happened since? And what was the difference between this vision and the statist vision of conscription that came about? Well, one difference is that, as Demmett says, conscription and militarization rests on the notion that being a good citizen means being a good soldier. And that's certainly true. That was how I was raised. Being a good citizen meant being a good soldier. But there's always been the further aspect of that, which is that being a good soldier means being a good citizen. And if that is true, being a good soldier means being a good citizen, then a good soldier is one that questions what's going on, that challenges authority, that does those things. And that is part of the theory and tradition of universal service, okay? Now, what's happened since then is what I have described as the rise of alienated war. And this is something that Andrew Bacevich calls the new militarism. And let me just say a few things about that, and then conclude with, I guess, some questions about the different ways that we can understand militarism and militarization. The rise of a professional army in the United States has meant that the average American citizen has no relationship to what the military does, or even who the military is, okay? So there are statistics now that, whereas in my life, in my youth, everyone knew someone in the military, everyone's father had been in the military, whatever. Now the military is this kind of sequestered occupation off by itself that has very little impact in terms of personal dealings on the average American citizen. Now, there are subtle impacts, and these are ones that scholars of militarization, I think, rightly point out. There are subtle impacts in terms of the glorification of the military and thank the troops, you know, these are all heroes, et cetera, et cetera. And I also don't mean to deny that there are institutional impacts. An example is the extent to which the American police force and Western police forces are being militarized, the extent to which their procedures are ones in the United States have been brought back from American colonies like the Philippines and then inserted into American police keeping, okay? So I don't mean to deny that there aren't very real institutional aspects of militarization. But the fact of the matter is that the average person has no contact with what the military does. And this has led to two things, it seems to me. One is a bizarre glorification of soldiers, something that no one of my generation would have found other than ludicrous. The idea that every soldier is a hero, the idea that they should be honored for their sacrifices, no matter how immoral they are. And also, as Bacevich says, the notion that somehow military leaders have this special competence or whatever. All of this is based on people not being connected with the military, not knowing anyone in the military, not really knowing what the military does. And finally, second of all, it has meant a deference to what the state does in military matters in the United States that is really quite extraordinary. There is a complete indifference and detachment, really, of the American people from what the military does. The basic fact is that they don't care what the military does as long as their children don't have to fight in it. That is the baseline. As long as the average American does not have to fight in the military, there is deference to what the military does. I would add, as long as the average American doesn't have to pay for it either, so that wars are now fought not by raising taxes, but by borrowing money and shunning it off to later generations. What this has done, it seems to me, is basically created an alienated relationship between the American people and Western peoples generally, what the military does. This is a return, I think, to the militarism of the 18th century. What Demmett describes, it seems to me, is the type of militarization that was characteristic of the 20th century. It's a type of militarization that Sir Michael Howard has termed nationalized war, where in some sense, every citizen is a soldier. That was the model that you see in every militarized society in the 20th century. What we've returned to in the United States, and I think in other Western countries, is the 18th century model of militarism, which is basically a kind of a strange glorification of what the military does, but little connection between what the military does and the average person, other than on a cultural level, which basically, it seems to me, fits the fact of what we've returned to is 18th century models of imperialism, where the state is basically doing what it wants to do militarily, and the average person just looks on. Now, is this better or is it worse? I'm not going to make a judgment about that, because the fact is that no one wants to return to conscription as it was in the 1950s. It was a massive violation of civil liberties, and no one wants to return to that. But it seems to me that the story of conscription in the United States and in other Western countries like the United States is the story of the end of conscription and the rise of a new type of militarism. That in some ways, as I said, the argument then is better, worse, whatever. Let me, though, finally return to the great value of Demmett's book for a political philosopher. Political philosophy today does not want to talk about war. The only discussions of war go on in a little micro community called just war theory, which is kind of a marginalized group. And by and large, the hegemonic political philosophies, starting with Rawls and people like that, really act as if war does not occur. They have almost nothing to say about issues like conscription. They have nothing to say about problems of concentrated military power. They are, in my view, a kind of an acquiescence to what I've called alienated war today. And so I'm just so happy and grateful to read what Demet is doing and other people in critical military studies, because it seems to me exactly what we should be talking about now. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ryan. So we'll turn now to Professor Rachel Woodward, who's head of geography at Newcastle. Lovely, and a renowned scholar in the field of military geography with a focus on militarism in space and place, military land use, post-military landscapes, and military environmentalism. It's difficult to get across a slash in language, actually. So Professor Woodward's research encompasses a broad range of interdisciplinary themes, including militarism and gender, and identity in the military, and she's also co-editor of the Journal of War and Culture Studies and actively engaged in projects relating to the politics of civil-military relationships, military popular culture, and space observation and monitoring. I hope that sounds right. I hand over to you.
Well, hello, it's really nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I don't actually get out much because a lot of my time at the moment is spent being head of geography in Newcastle. So actually the opportunity to come and talk about a research idea is just delightful, I have to say, and it's really nice to sort of just come out of Newcastle and into Durham. I remember seeing Demet's book. I printed it out because I've got to get a free copy. There we go. You see that on camera. I remember seeing it when I was looking through the Advances in Critical Military Studies list on Edinburgh University College website, thinking, oh, that looks interesting. And I'd seen some of the stuff we'd had in Critical Military Studies, the journal, a few years ago. And I thought, oh, well, I've got to get my hands on that. And of course, like everyone, I think I must get that. It's on my list, but don't get round to it. So I was really pleased to actually get a copy and come along to here because it's made me read it, and which has been great. It's been a delight, really. So thank you for that. The Critical Military Studies series was set up by Victoria Basham and Sarah Bulmer a few years ago. It took a while to get going, I think because they recognised that there was a lot of really good work there, primarily by people doing PhDs, but it was going to take quite a while for those scholars to get their PhDs, get the research done, get the books written and get them out. But it was really interesting looking at the most recent update on the list, because I think it really is being seen now as the place where there's going to bring together, literally, that's what it says on the tin, right? Critical studies of the military in one place from a sort of sociology or social sciences perspective. And it is doing something quite distinctive, I think, in that it is quite cross-disciplinary and is full of very empirically rich books, which I think yours is. So it's quite a nice little series. So I was pleased to see the book in that series. I just wanted to make sort of three observations about, it's always like the wider contexts to the book. So I'm not a socio-legal studies person, and I don't study conscientious objection, but I study a lot of things around the sociology of the military and the geographies of military activity. And it struck me that there's several things that I think are important about the book in terms of that wider context. So critical military studies, and when I use the word, and it may be a bit pompous, but I sit there going, oh, we talk about a critical military studies project, as if it's a sort of, sort of loose connection of ideas. And the idea that you could have a distinctively critical military studies started to emerge in the sort of mid-1990s with people like Paul Highgate, people like Aaron Belkin, people like myself, sitting there thinking, military sociology as it exists is a really specific thing, and we know we don't want to do that. It's very much operationalized by what Paul Highgate calls an engineering model. So you do sociology in order to help the military to function better. And that's not really what we individually, I mean, we were working individually, not collectively, but we were trying to move towards a much more critical perspective that was going to draw on things like, insights from post-structuralist thoughts around power and around gender and around identities and around the social construction of, social life. So the idea of a critical military studies sort of emerged and started to really gain traction in the early 2000s. And of course, we had two things going on in the early 2000s. We had the war in Iraq, followed by the war in Afghanistan. The war in Iraq was an unpopular war amongst many scholars. The war in Afghanistan was very little known in many ways, apart from the fact of its ongoing existence. And this was quite a step change from the Cold War era when, you know, big standing national armies and the military could be understanding in quite distinct ways. And what happens, particularly in the UK, US, Canada, during those years of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan was very, very distinctive government efforts to justify and rationalise these military endeavours. And there had been this real sort of absence of visibility of figures of the soldier, but this real sudden government effort to show care and understanding for the soldier in a context where, as Chenny has quite rightly pointed out, you know, most of us are actually really disconnected from military forces. And there was a huge surge in scholarly interest in this, in sort of governmental activities around, you know, whether it's support the troops or help for heroes or around ideas around appropriate medical care and citizenship, or whether it's around sort of public displays and public discourses around military phenomena. And that sort of body of work has grown and grown and grown. And I think it's really expanded ideas across the social sciences about how we can look at the military, which I think is really, really important. I mean, scholarship or contemporary scholarship of military phenomena across the social sciences is about all sorts of things now. It's about people, it's about places, it's about emotions, it's about bodies, it's about everyday practices, it's about states, it's about legal frameworks, it's about spaces and places. So there's a whole range of places in which military activities, military phenomena are being identified as being present in a context where, as Chenny has quite rightly pointed out, we've had these really quite profound shifts in the way military phenomena are understood in some contexts. And underpinning a lot of contemporary work on military phenomena, and again, this comes back to Demet's book, because I think this says something really quite important in that, is this sort of unspoken or often unspoken idea about how hard it is to do this research. So if you get two military researchers who sort of identify on the critical end of scholarship, if you get two of those in a room, sooner or later you're going to start talking about access and methodologies and how you actually go about doing this research, because it's recognised to be difficult. You know, there's issues of access, there's issues of data, the availability of reliable data, data that you just cannot get, information from military, defence, security people, information from the private sector, because of course, in some contexts, US, UK are exactly the same on this. The amount of outsourcing is phenomenal. So the amount of activities through which military phenomena can be understood actually requires you to engage with the private sector now. It's so removed from state. And it's something that, of course, Demet's book talks about. So doing this sort of research on conscientious objection, you say this in the introduction, actually how difficult it was to do. And it's, you know, there's something very distinctive about your sample, which you're very open about, which I think is, and I think it's really important to be open. But I think we should recognise just how difficult it is to do this kind of research with people who are living and engaging on a day-to-day basis with an anti-militarist politics in a context that is so hostile to it. So it's important to see, and I think it's also really good to see something that's framing itself as socio-legal studies within critical military studies, because there's a lot of us who sit there. I mean, I'm a geographer, I'm a bit of a sociologist, there's people from international relations and political scientists and so forth. But I think also that perspective that socio-legal studies brings, which is very distinctive, I think is really important. So that's the first thing I was going to say. Secondly, I was going to talk a bit about militarism, because I won't rehash what Chenny's already said, but critical military studies has quite an interesting relationship with militarism. Like, what is it? How do you conceptualize it? Do you know what it is when you see it? How do you counter it? Can you actually counter it? All the rest of it. And it's an ongoing debate about what militarism is. You know, is it an ideology? Is it a process? Are we going to distinguish, and I think we should, between militarism and militarization and military activities and military phenomena? These are quite complex questions. And these questions also get wrapped up in these quite fraught debates about how we conceptualize the military in the first place. And a very common way of conceptualizing the military across social sciences, but particularly in sort of sociological accounts of the military, is to see sort of two spheres. You have this binary thinking around civil and military, and actually there's a lot of argument that I think holds water now about how you cannot separate the two. They are absolutely interconnected, and the idea of this binary thinking actually is really counterproductive to fairly progressive ways to thinking about the military. Anyway, I could go on for hours about that, but what I wanted to say about militarism was specifically how little work there is in critical military studies that looks at anti-militarism. There's a lot of statements about, oh, we need an anti-militarist politics, but I think there's something very different from making those statements to actually doing the work that explores what anti-militarism is. And I think, again, that's one reason why the book is so valuable, because of course you go and it's a really fine-grained, textured, detailed analysis from people who are articulating an anti-militarist politics. And it's actually rare to find that level of detail and that level of really sort of precise examination, which is one reason why I think it's so valuable. So I sort of cheered when I got to page 2. So I'm just going to quote you back at yourself now, Demet. Anti-militarism as a stance isn't, so you're talking about anti-militarism as a stance isn't sufficient. And you also say, without an empirical focus, anti-militarist researchers risk detaching themselves from the real world. And I sort of made a little sort of marginal comment, too right, that's absolutely, I just think, that sort of detailed empirical work is what we need. So I was really pleased to see that and really enjoyed sort of getting to know those arguments. And I think the third thing I wanted to say, I mean, I often do this, I sort of go into other disciplines and say, well, I'm a geographer and this is what I think, and it's about space and place and all the rest of it. And sometimes people laugh and maybe people are just humouring me, but anyway, I've got a captive audience, so I will just say the other thing that I thought was really interesting about your book. You're not coming at this as a geographer, so you're not focusing on the sort of the spaces and places and spatialities of conscientious objection and of anti-militarism. But I was really interested to see how much of that is in the book. And I do think that's important more generally for critical military studies. I think critical military studies is very dominated by Anglophone scholarship. Okay, so you have a bunch of scholars working in Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, South Africa, and across Europe who are using English as the medium of communication. And there's something that follows from that about what those people are then looking at. We're looking at the stuff around ourselves. Now, I'm not for a moment saying that shouldn't be the case, because I think there's some very valuable scholarship going on. And I think that sometimes when you're looking at military phenomena, the complexities of culture and place and context are so great that actually speaking authoritatively and sensibly about other contexts can be phenomenally difficult. So I think there's sort of reasons for that. But I think on the other hand, what benefits critical military studies is the idea that we can actually know in much more detail what's going on in places beyond the US, Canada, Australia, the usual suspects, Israel as well. And I think that that's one real value for your book, because it is bringing to life a whole new context where, there's bits and pieces of knowledge, but not necessarily as fine-grained as it could be. And it's all Turkey is, as you show, it's obviously a really important case to be looking at. And the last point I wanted to say was just about what struck me about all the spaces of activism and spaces of activity that come up in the book. There's everything from conversations about or sort of observations, I should say, about the obvious legal spaces, the law courts, the solicitors' offices, prisons. There's the military spaces themselves, parade spaces and barrack spaces. There's the workplaces. You mentioned people in university at one point. There's a great, sorry, this is so nerdy, but there's a footnote which talks about the August sort of conscript send-off at the bus station. And I'm sitting there thinking, yeah, you know, this is really interesting. You have this place, this transit place and a place of complete transience, transportation, which seems to be integral to the transformation of the conscripts from, you know, regular civilian into a conscript, you know, and the discussion of it was in the written statement of, I think, one of your interviewees, and he's clearly talking about it as what seemed to me as a sort of transformational space. So little things like that I thought were really interesting. Things like not being able to book into hotels, being very careful about which roads you drive on, the ways in which personal access to space is completely changed by this decision to take part in an activist politics. So I did think that there was a lot there and a lot of stuff around just the texture of you know, military identities within Turkey and how that is played across the space in Turkey. And the very final thing I wanted to say about space is about spaces for discussion, because obviously publishing that book opens up the opportunities for conversation, and this is what always happens. This is why we publish, right? Because we want to open up spaces for a conversation. And I was very struck by a sentence you write in the conclusion where you say, even though conscientious objection has attracted some attention in the academy, it still cannot be debated publicly and in academic arenas in Turkey. So I was really interested to think about the future plans that you might have for dissemination and possibly even translation of your work to enable wider sort of purchase on the work, because I do think it's an important book. Anyway, I could go on for hours, but I won't, because there's other people that I'd like to hear speak. So I'd just like to say how much I enjoyed the book.
Thank you very much, Professor Woodward. So we turn now to Professor Özgür Cina, who is Professor at the University of Greenwich School of Law and Criminology and also Deputy Head of School. He's a lawyer, works as legal expert for the Council of Europe, and his main research interests include the right to conscientious objection, freedom of expression and freedom of thought, conscience and religion. And he's published and edited several books on these topics in Turkey. Yeah, so we know that you'd hoped to be with us here today, but we're unable to do so. So we're delighted that you can still join us online. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And Demet, congratulations on your book. And I'm so sorry, I really look forward to be there. But unfortunately, as you know, because of the family emergency, I had to come to Turkey. I'm now just connecting from the hospital because my mother, she's hospitalized. But I will try to do my best. Okay, so I hope you can hear me perfectly. Yeah. So I'd like to start. Yes, the conscientious objection is a big issue. Yes, over the years, people have been put in a position to reject military service for a variety of reasons. Conscientious objection, which is the most striking way of opposing war and military service, involves objectors refusing to perform military service for reasons of conscience based on profound religious, ethical, moral, philosophical, humanitarian, or similar convictions. The subject has been examined from historical, sociological, and political viewpoints in addition to the activist angle. It has also attracted great interest in the field of human rights, and since 1950 has been on the agenda of governmental and non-governmental organizations. Objectors have been accused in the past, and even now still are, of being cowards and traitors for refusing to perform military service. And an obligation to defend nation often described as one of the most fundamental duties of citizenship. Many objectors are subject to discrimination and imprisonments or are forced to flee from their native countries. In countries where the army is especially powerful, like Turkey, Israel, South Korea, obviously the more attention must be paid to the question of conscientious objection. There should be also be public and academic debate of the fact that in these countries, the armed forces have a unique status in that they run their own industries, schools, universities, and hospitals. This issue is particularly controversial in Turkey, where objectors are subject to lifelong criminal prosecutions and persecution. Supporters of the right to conscientious objections also face severe penalties. And also Turkey is the only member state of the Council of Europe which still fails to recognize the right to conscientious objection and to alternative service. Prior to examining the situation in Turkey, of course, I think it will be really good to look at the international law. At present, the right to CEO is explicitly recognized only by Article 10/2 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union and by Article 12/1 of the Ibero-American Convention on Young People's Rights. As regards the judicial and non-judicial organs of both the United Nations and European systems, the right is accepted as a legitimate exercise of the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. The recognition of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion is, in its turn, based on the United Declaration on Human Rights adopted in 1948, as you know. Although the declaration doesn't mention the right to CEO specifically, Article 1 states it means all human beings, are endowed with reason and conscience. Also in Article 18, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. In addition to protecting the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, international documents have developed the right to CEO on various pretexts by means of United Nations mechanisms. For example, Human Rights Committee in 1989 stated that many individuals have claimed the right to refuse to perform military service on the basis that such right derives from their freedoms under Article 18. Therefore, though the many views expressed in relation to individuals' communications as to whether ICCPR had been violated, the Human Rights Committee reconciled Article 18 with the right to CEO. In its views, it has been asserted that the right to conscientious objection is protected by the forum internum, aspects of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Because as you know, there are two aspects of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, forum internum and forum externum. Forum internum, it means a state cannot intervene in a person's inner being. In other words, in the event of the examining this right, in the context of, for example, forum externum aspect, in the event of legitimate aims of the state being established, then intervention by the state would be valid. If I just repeat, forum internum, as I said, it's all about human being is inner being. Nobody can interfere. But when we look at the forum externum, yes, but based on the legitimate expectations or legitimate aims, the states can interfere with the forum externum of the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So, United Nations Mechanism Human Rights Committee, especially the recent views, they are all about in the favor of forum internum. It is really good, positive developments in international law, I have to say. But on the other hand, there is another regional mechanism which is very important called European Court of Human Rights, okay? So the European Court of Human Rights, I have to say, when you compare with the Human Rights Committee, it was very conservative, and still I believe it's very conservative on the subject of right to conscientious objection. And for a long time, and I have to say until July 2011, Bayatyan case, and the European Court of Human Rights didn't find any contribution or intervention or a violation of Article 9 of the Convention because of Article 4/3 of the Convention. And then in the case of Ülke versus Turkey, European Court of Human Rights decided there is a violation of Article 3, which is about torture and inhuman or degrading treatment. But we, as academics, lawyers, we all argue, actually, there is a violation of Article 9. The conscientious objection to military service is strongly related or connected to Article 9. Why you are deciding some things about Article 3 or Article 14, but not about Article 9. And this attitude, approach, has been changed in the case of Bayatyan, July 2011. So, when we look at the Bayatyan case, finally the European Court of Human Rights established there had been a violation of Article 9. Okay, so it was the first time. But still, and I am very critical of these decisions, and because the court still, when they make the decision, still they look at the conscientious objection to military service issue from the angle of forum externum of this freedom. So, and that's why just a couple of minutes ago I said, and unfortunately the court's decision still not really perfectly 100% matching with the Human Rights Committee. Okay, so, but overall, finally, the European Court of Human Rights and the United Nations, both mechanisms recognize the right to conscientious objection to military service. This is a quite positive development in international human rights law, I have to say. Now, what about the situation in Turkey? As you know, Turkey has been a candidate member of European Union since 2005. In Turkey, the army has always been powerful. Its armed forces being the second largest army after the USA in the NATO. As a percentage of gross domestic product, Turkey has one of the largest military budgets in the world. It is always in the top 20, I have to say. And also military service is of a great social, cultural, political, and economic importance for Turkish citizens. It is compulsory for every male Turkish citizen to perform military service when this young guy reaches 20 years of age. At present, there are over 600 objectors. Osman Murat Ülke, Mehmet Taran, Halil Savda, they have all been imprisoned on several occasions on account of their refusal to obey military service or military authority. The European Court of Human Rights identified a key issue in the case of Ülke versus Turkey in 2006, when it stated that there is no specific provision in Turkish law governing penalties for those who refuse to wear uniform on grounds of conscience or religion. For the degrading treatment, the European Court of Human Rights found a violation of Article 3 of the Convention, ordering Turkey to pay compensation of 11,000 euros. The European Court of Human Rights used the term civil death when illustrating the problematic part of objectors in Turkey. For example, Uğur Yorulmaz, a Turkish objector, he passed away recently, elaborated as follows. The Uğur Yorulmaz, with his own words, the way how he described civil death. There is a tremendous social pressure you have to face. You cannot find a job. You cannot go abroad. You cannot get a passport. It is indeed a heavy burden when you think about all this. Then there are all the people around you, your family, your friends that you have to face and struggle against. And you have to keep doing this every single day, all your life, numerous times. Nothing will be over once you have made your declaration. It will continue for the rest of your life. You cannot just do it and get over it with. It will stay with you. This is the definition of civil death, how Uğur Yılmaz, one of the objectors, how he described. In conformity with the requirements of the European Union accession process, Turkey has made some reforms to its legislation, but the government hasn't recognized the EU's legal and social stance on conscientious objection. It's very unfortunate. In the process report issued by the EU regarding Turkey, attention was drawn to the continued absence of the right to CEO and the situation of objectors and those that support them. Now the question is, why the right to CEO has not been recognized in Turkey? Why do objectors suffer civil death? I guess we have to look at the Turkish legal system first of all. Article 72 of the Turkish Constitution of the 1982 states, national service is the right and duty of every Turk. The manner in which this service shall be performed or considered as performed, either in the armed forces or in the public service, shall be regulated by law. Now, when you read this article, Article 72, it seems there is like an alternative civilian service, something like that in Turkey. But unfortunately, it's not. Because the law in question is the Military Service Act, which clearly states every male Turkish citizen is obliged to perform his military service in accordance with this law. And then Article 45 of the Military Penal Code states a person is acting in accordance with conscientious or religious scruples doesn't free him from criminal liability when the commission or omissions of certain acts constitutes a crime. So, but, you know, yes, Constitution 72 says something, then Military Service Act, Article 1 states something else, and then the Article 45 of the Military Penal Code says something else. So, okay, well, how the military Supreme Court or the courts, how they interpret the law? This is the question. Unfortunately, the courts still, they don't recognize the right to CEO in Turkey. So, yes, this is one of the problems. There is no right to conscientious objection to military service in Turkey. There is no alternative civilian service. Plus, and there are people, for example, we call yoklama kaçağı in Turkish, but in English, failure to attend the draft examination, or people, they run away from army as a bakaya, it means draft evasion, or firar, desertion, or persistent disobedience. I mean, there are all these crimes being described in the Turkish Penal Code. And these people, they're being carried penalties of between 1 month and 10 years of imprisonment. And furthermore, the objectors are subject to disciplinary proceedings in addition to imprisonment. For example, Halil Savda, who refused to shave off his beard or wear a prison uniform, was put in a cell for a total of more than 40 days. Additionally, an objector, maybe you are, this person is still a civilian, or anybody who supports objectors and the right to conscientious objection or criticize the army in any way may be persecuted in line with Article 318 of the Turkish Penal Code, which states those who engage in activities or propaganda that would alienate the public from military service shall receive a prison sentence between 6 months and 2 years. And second paragraph says, if the crime is committed through publication or broadcasting, the sentence shall increase by 50%. So it means when you read this article in conjunction with 2006 anti-terror law, a sentence of up to 4.5 years could be handed down to the objectors or their supporters. So as you can see from the Turkish law, there is no recognition of conscientious objection to military service, and objectors that are imprisoned, prosecuted, punished heavily. Even their supporters are punished heavily. So the question is, why? Why is like that? What's the political, economic, and social and cultural aspects of militarism in Turkey? I guess we have to look at the history first of all. The great majority of people in Turkey believe that they have to join and love the army if they wish to be real heroes. The army has been called a school that brings about civilization. In 1931, Atatürk, a founder of the Turkish Republic, as you know, spoke on the topic in Konya. He said, there are very few examples in the world and in history of the kind of union established between our nation and the military, made up of the nation's heroic children. We can always be proud of this national manifestation. My friends, when I talk about the military, I talk about the bright children of the Turkish nation. Atatürk often stressed the relationship between the Turkish nation and the army. Basically, the idea, every Turk is born as a soldier. This is the motto has been accepted in Turkey. It is also important to mention that the women were given an important role. The role is giving birth to soldiers. So compulsory military service, those not only renders first-class citizenship exclusively masculinity, it also gives masculinity itself as a definition. The first step on the path to manhood is military service. It is furthermore a fundamental condition of manliness. For instance, many families would not allow their daughters to marry a man until he has performed his military service. So, in conclusion, when they established the republic, the goal of Turkey's founders was to create a new nation. In order to accomplish this, they changed the structure of the state and base the dynamics of society on the idea of military nation. The armed forces have therefore always had an important role and mission in society. In this context, compulsory military service perform an important role in the service of military nation myth. However, Turkey must seek a resolution of this problem as soon as possible. For the right to conscientious objection is now explicitly accepted as a legitimate expression of the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion by the United Nations and the European mechanisms, to which Turkey is a signatory. If Turkey intends to join the EU, it must make changes to its domestic law to ensure it doesn't contravene the international norms which recognize the right to CEO. So thank you very much for listening to me. And again, so sorry not to be there with you guys. But Demet, congratulations on your book. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we turn finally now to Julia Uchpina, who's a human rights lawyer and a researcher focusing on conscientious objection to military service. She's the legal coordinator for the Association for Conscientious Objection and one of the co-founders of the Nonviolent Education and Research Center based in Istanbul. She's been a member of the War Resisters Institution Council and Executive Committee since 2014, and is the author of numerous reports and has published articles on conscientious objection to military service in Turkey. I'll turn to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I also want to thank a lot for inviting me this precious event. And lots of things have been said about militarism and also conscientious objection and the legal basis of conscientious objection in Turkey and also internationally. I am going to try to focus on some aspects of what has been happening at the practical level and what the motivations of conscientious objectors in Turkey. So I want to start from the numbers. So the number of conscientious in Turkey is unknown. The government provided a number to the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers about a month ago and said that according to the information provided by the Ministry of National Defense, there have been a total of 152 people who have declared conscientious objection since 2006. This data is, I guess, it's been recorded just after the Ülke versus Turkey case decision from the Court of Human Rights. We assumed that this number is derived from applications made through official channels. We assume so because our applications to the Ministry for Information about the numbers were rejected on different grounds. Association for Conscientious Objection was, and now Conscientious Objection Watch is keeping data. However, it does not reflect the real numbers either. Between 1989 and 2023, March, last month, 455 individuals have informed our organization that they have announced their conscientious objection to military service. However, it's estimated that the total number of conscientious objectors is much higher than this number. The number of men who seek to refrain from being compelled to act contrary to their conscience, yet do not announce their declaration, and those who feel compelled to submit themselves to the shortened military service by payment for reasons of conscientious objection are unknown too. In addition, the number of objectors from Jehovah's Witnesses is unknown as their data is not shared publicly. The idea of conscientious objection was introduced by a number of anarchists as a political stand against all the means of militarism in 1989. The majority of the conscientious objectors have been following the same motivation and claiming a right to reject any kind of service to militarist institutions. We define this motivation as total objection. So far, a small of total objectors have stated that they are motivated by their Islamist background beliefs. On the other hand, a group of political objectors select not to serve the Turkish army, motivated by their ethnic identities, but they also say that it's possible for them to serve another army for just wars, for example, in relation to their ethnicity. The last group categorically favors civilian service over armed service, and Jehovah's Witnesses occupy a major place in this category. No matter what motivations the conscientious objectors have, the consequences of their refusal are the same. They are under the threat of repetitive imprisonment, administrative and judicial fines, and also disciplinary proceedings. As a result of the fines, their bank accounts are seized. Thus, they refrain from having bank accounts on their names. They cannot these have been said, but I'm going to repeat what the objectors have been practicing. They cannot freely travel and stay in the places registration is needed because of identity checks. They would be stepped out from an intercity bus or be awakened at 5 or 3 or 5, 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning in a hotel by security forces. And the objectors neither have a right to work in state institutions because fulfillment of military service is prerequisite, or in the private sector legally because it's illegal to hire a person who is deemed as a fugitive. So they are forced to work unregistered with low salaries. The fulfillment of military service is also related to higher education. A man can postpone his military obligation until a certain age, depending on his education. But if he has passed this age, he must perform his military service. Otherwise, he cannot enroll in an educational institution and continue his studies until the end of his service. The objectors who are deemed as deserters, the ones who started to serve in the army, but then they somehow flee from the army, and then they don't go back. They are deemed as deserters, do not have a right to vote, and they cannot be elected as a parliamentarian, for example. And in short, they cannot exercise their civil rights on an equal basis with other citizens, and are subjected to live in conditions of civil death, as the European Court of Human Rights has stated. Some of the objectors who do not want to continue living under this situation sometimes accept the opportunity to pay a certain amount of money to the Ministry of Defense and serve for a month. There were also women conscientious objectors. Women are not obliged to do military service, but like total objectors, women also declare their objection with the political motivation of not cooperating with militarist mentality and institutions. These practices, as Demet discusses extensively in her study, reveal that militarism has permeated almost all areas of life in Turkey, and that if people refuse to cooperate with militarism, they will be punished in the worst way by being subjected to civilian death. It's precisely for this reason that the struggle for conscientious objection corresponds to the struggle to live with dignity through the choices one makes. In the book, under the titles of Militarization of Society and Demilitarization of Society, and the chapters from 4 to 6, Demet deeply elaborates the concept of national security, militarization of society, gendering effects of militarism. Demet's study provides a wealth of data on interviews she conducted about the problems a person might face after declaring their conscientious objection. These narratives are impressive in terms of how these experiences are not just situations, but how they affect people's lives. As a whole, Demet's book makes a holistic assessment of Turkey's socio-political and legal history in the context of conscientious objection. I would like to thank Demet for bringing together all the discussions, data, and interviews in her study and presenting them to us. Thank you so much, Demet, and congratulations.